Hey Philippa, where would you find rhyming couplets in the wild?
Now, don't laugh at this next part, please.
On a poetry.
Oh, come on. Why would you think that's funny?
Oh, that's so bad. Hello, and welcome to this short series where we will be discussing different topics that we come across in our big picture thinking. But also I hope it'll be a helpful journey towards finding meaning. I'm by no means the most seasoned traveller, but through my own journey from atheism to being a Christian and also working for a church and walking alongside people who are wrestling with these very questions, I hope I can be a wise travelling companion. If there's good stuff in here, presume I learnt it from someone far wiser than me, and if there's anything that's particularly unhelpful, that's from me. I apologise, forget about it and move on. Anyway, grab a beverage, let's think about the meaning of life. My name is Chris, and this is Fool's Talk. It was the Greek philosopher Socrates who said that the unexamined life is not worth living, and that's probably one of the most quoted sayings in classical literature outside the Bible, and yet I don't actually think modern people take it seriously. I think we have this idea that because we live in the 21st century West, one of the most technologically advanced societies that we have ever seen, that almost by proxy we have every other question of life sorted out as well. But I don't think that's quite true. I think as a result of the advancing technology that we don't heed the advice of the ancients and live examined lives. I mean, when was the last time that you remember seriously sitting down and thinking about the meaning of life? Or can you remember the last time that you were alone and sat alone with your own thoughts, and rather than sit and think, actually you distracted yourself? You know, you put something on Netflix, you went on Facebook, you went on Instagram or whatever. We don't like thinking about these things. We don't like thinking about what it means to live a good and profound human life. Our education systems are geared towards learning the how and the what rather than the why of life. We prioritise knowledge and accumulation of information over what it means to live a meaningful life. A quest for meaning, like all quests, has a definitive beginning point. You take, say, Lord of the Rings, for example, where Frodo gets the ring, or The Hobbit, where the dwarves rock up at Bilbo's house and propose to him an adventure. But generally speaking, the beginning of all quests for meaning start with a time for questions. When life itself becomes a question, we begin to look for an answer. Now, when it comes to things like belief and faith, I think that someone like Sigmund Freud would argue that belief is just wish fulfillment. It's just projection. You know, we have needs and we have desires, and so we believe. But I don't think that's quite right. For me, and I think for other people as well, people don't become seekers for meaning because they want to believe. People become seekers for meaning because they disbelieve. People start looking for answers to the big questions of life because they disbelieve what it is that they used to believe, because it no longer provides them with satisfying answers to the questions that they are asking. And it's important to think through the big questions. It's important to think through the meaning of life, because I think that meaning isn't just necessary in order to live, but I actually think having meaning is necessary in order to survive. Here up on screen we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and yeah, there's lots of problems with it. People have criticised it for all various reasons, but the assumption that I want to challenge in it is that having adequate resources is enough. The idea that having enough food, enough water, and enough shelter is in and of itself enough to keep you alive. The French philosopher Albert Camus, who is once again entering the public consciousness thanks to his book The Plague, obviously at time of recording this is during the coronavirus lockdown, but Camus argues that suicide is the fundamental philosophical question. He writes this: "To lose one's life is a little thing, but to see the meaning of this life dissipated, to see our reason for existing disappear, that is what is unbearable. One cannot live without meaning."
When people commit suicide, no one ever understands. You know what I mean? People commit suicide, people go, I don't understand why. And I go, you don't? Where, you live in a cotton candy house or something? You don't know about life? how it only disappoints and gets worse and worse until it ends in a catastrophe? There's two reasons guys will hang themselves to the neck. One is, like we said, to escape this worthless masquerade of a life we pretend we have.
If having meaning is so unbearable that it drives you to the point where you take your own life, actually having enough physical resources to survive isn't sufficient. So when we talk about this hierarchy of needs and having, food and water right at the bottom, I don't actually think that's true, because unless you have a reason to eat, unless you have a reason to drink, and unless you have a reason to go on living, you're not going to do it. And so having a meaning of life which permeates everything you do and gives you a reason to continue going, that's so important, not just to live, but also just to survive. And this isn't just an observation that I have made. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl was locked up in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. And in his book, A Man's Search for Meaning, what he noticed was that those who survived the concentration camps weren't necessarily the physically strongest, they weren't the fittest. It was those who had a big enough sense of purpose and meaning in their lives that kept them going. It wasn't the strongest who survived, but those who had a reason to keep going. Or, as he puts it in his book, those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. And perhaps the assumption that we make is that survival in and of itself is enough. But again, I don't quite think that's true. I think there is far much more to life than merely being alive. As the great civil rights reformer Martin Luther King said, he says, there are some things so dear, some things so precious, some things so eternally true that they are worth dying for. And I submit to you that if a man has not discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live. And actually, I think we intuitively get this. In a society where we lack for nothing, where the large majority of us have enough food on the table, we have enough entertainment, we have everything that we could want, it still doesn't feel like it's enough. It still feels like there's something not quite right. It still feels like there's something missing. I think having a concrete meaning of life gives us an understanding of our identity. It helps us figure out who we are, but it also gives us a sense of belonging and community, and it helps us place ourselves in the grand narrative of the universe. It helps us determine right from wrong, our moral choices, our ethical stances. But even more fundamentally than that, having a meaning of life determines what is reality for us. What is reality? And without any of these things, I think the lives we lead will be impoverished ones. But if living an examined life is so important and so beneficial to us, why don't more people do it? There's two reasons that I'd like to suggest. And the first one is diversion. Actually, we'd rather do other things. We surround ourselves with entertaining distraction like, social media, Netflix, YouTube, whatever. And I think actually that takes up quite a lot of our capacity to think, because we're busy seeking stimulus. And this isn't just a hunch. There was a psychological study done about 6 years ago that showed that participants in the experiment were more likely and preferred to give themselves small electric shocks than to just sit and be with their own thoughts for 20 minutes. They preferred a little bit of stimulus than time sitting and thinking. We divert from thinking about the big questions because we don't really like doing it. The unexamined life isn't worth living, but generally, we live unexamined lives. And apart from distracting ourselves, the other reason we don't think about the meaning of life is delay. Later, we say, after I've been to university, after I've got a well-paying job, after I've, bought a house, as if that's ever going to happen. Thanks, boomers. As if when we've got a family, when we've retired, etc. Later, we always say. Even though we know we're going to die, we don't actually think that we're going to die. I like to think that I'm quite a sensible person, but I can tell you the dumbest thing that I think I've ever done. It was when I was 19 years old. I was in Uganda. At the time, I owned a motorbike, and while I was in Uganda, I thought I would borrow this rickety old motorcycle taxi from this guy that I'd never met before. And two of my friends hopped on the back, and we, drove around the local towns and villages, 40, 50 miles an hour, no helmet, no gloves, no protection at all on this motorbike with, well, we had absolutely no idea how safe it was. And, one wrong move, one part of that motorcycle failed, we probably would have crashed and died. I'm quite sensible. I take precautions when I'm out on the roads, but I just didn't think anything would happen to me. Luckily, nothing did. But do you see my point? We tend to think that we're invincible, that it's other people who are eventually going to die. And so when it comes to thinking about the big questions of life, we always say later, later, later. But sorry to have to tell you this, eventually we run out of laters. Eventually, our lives will end as well. But if we're far more comfortable procrastinating or distracting ourselves, what is it that sets people off on a quest for meaning? Firstly, I think curiosity. It's probably the first question that all human beings learn. Why? And if you've ever had a conversation with a child where they ask a question and you say, here's what the answer is, and they say, well, why? And you give an answer and they say, why, and why, and why. They keep going. It becomes really annoying. But actually, I think it illustrates the point quite well, because when curiosity drives the beginning of a quest for meaning, it comes from that question, why? You keep asking why, and why, and why, and then when you no longer get an answer that you find satisfactory, you go out looking for one. Like a really basic one, if you've never actually sat down and considered it and you've got no idea where to start, try this one. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there something rather than nothing? And thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages have been written about answering that one question alone. If you're here going, oh, I want to try and find some meaning to life, but I don't know where to begin, try beginning there. Why is there something rather than nothing? Alternatively, big changes in people's lives make them reconsider the fundamental questions of the world. It can be a personal health scare or the tragic death of a loved one, or worldwide events that turn everything upside down. I'm recording this on VE Day, so maybe you can consider the two world wars or the collapse of the Soviet Union from the past century as world-changing events that would have made people reconsider their fundamental questions of life. But the coronavirus, this whole global pandemic, which has totally shifted our society, how we interact with each other, how the economy functions, is a fantastic time to trigger people to ask, hang on, all this stuff that I was doing, I can't do anymore. Why is it that I was doing them in the first place? Why is it that I did those things? Why is it that I had those jobs? Why is it that I maintain those relationships? Something that flips your world upside down naturally makes you ask the question, well, why? If we base our lives around things like freedom or independence or the pursuit of our own goals, having those things stripped away makes us question, what on earth were we doing that for? But there's also experiences in our own lives which point beyond our everyday reality towards a greater depth of meaning that we know we don't currently have. I told a terrible joke at the beginning about poetry entirely to set up this segue. Because the man born in this building here with the plaque on it was the English poet W.H. Auden. Now, Auden was a left-wing atheist at the start of World War II, and he was living in Yorkville, which was a German-speaking part of Manhattan at the time. And one weekend, he was at the cinema watching a documentary about the Nazi siege of Poland. However, when Polish people appeared on the screen, to his shock, the German crowd, obviously on the side of Germany in the war, started shouting out in unison, kill them, kill them, kill them. Auden said that he sat there in the darkness and in 2 minutes his entire worldview was overturned. He said that he'd always thought that people were good. Sure, there's room for improvement, but nothing that better education, improved political discourse couldn't solve. But in the face of what he was witnessing, he could only conclude that humans had evil in their hearts. He went on to write in one of his poems that evil shares our bed and sits at our table. But then he was in trouble. He had to say that Hitler and the SS were absolutely evil. But he'd spent his time as a left-wing intellectual saying that there were no such things as absolutes. Everything's relative. Nothing is absolute. But that was absolutely evil. So Auden left the cinema as a seeker for the unconditional absolute. And that's really what the quest to find meaning is all about. A quest to find a meaning of life that is unconditional, a meaning that will hold up in any and all circumstances you end up facing. And so my challenge to you as we begin to draw this to a close is, do you think enough? Are you living an examined life? It's no longer time to say later, later, later. There is no better time than now. What is your reason for life? What is your meaning of life? And if you don't have an answer, why not go out to find it? I'd love to help you do that. And I'm sure there are plenty of Christians who at this stage would be like, Chris, don't forget to mention Jesus. You know, I'm a Christian. We'll eventually get to Jesus, but I want to be upfront about it. I don't want to take part in any Jesus smuggling, you know. I don't want to lead you on this lovely journey only for you to discover that I've led you down some Jesus-y themed garden path. That's not what I'm about. I don't think it's fair on you, and I don't think it's particularly honest of me. I don't want to try and prove anything across this series. You know, I only want to try and be, well, a semi-biased guide to help you think through living an examined life. That's the plan for this series. We've got a new episode coming out next week. Keep an eye out for it. But it has been great hanging out with you. I hope you have found this useful. In the meantime, my name is Chris. This has been Fool's Talk.